So we're going to jump to the next two subjects, which are kind of related, which are oil and gas and mineral rights. Oil and gas rights are something that we saw a spurt of increased business for back when the energy prices jumped up in, I guess it was 07, 08, somewhere around there, where people were looking to see if they had rights to the oil underneath their property. Everything from, Joe Smith, the individual residential property owner, to farmers and everything else. Obviously, as we all know, the biggest issue with oil and gas rights are they're often split off from the surface rights, and often a very long time ago. It could be 100 years ago they were split off. And the problem is, in order to find it, you have to go back to that point and then track it since then. The other problem is that there's a lot of wild cards in the mix. Some states have dormancy laws. It split off in 1920, and XYZ Energy Company bought it in 1920, and then the property was owned by the Smith family, the Jones family, the Brown family, none of which had oil and gas rights. But now, 30 years later, this state, whatever it is, has a dormancy rule where if that oil and gas ownership isn't maintained or activated, it fails. Well, where does it go at that point? Does it revert back to the original owner that split it off? Does it revert back to the owner at the time when it goes dormant? Or does it revert to the owner at the present day? The logic you can all figure out from the state statutes in the different states, but it's important to notice that. The other thing it's important to look at is if you see oil and gas rights split off from a chain, and it could be split off one of two ways. It could be split off by granting from the current owner, and the current owner retains the property. It could be split off by retention, where the current owner sells the surface, retains the mineral or the oil and gas. And you have to look at either one. The important thing to look at is, did the surface owner actually own the oil and gas rights when they deeded it? Because just because you find an oil and gas split in 1962 doesn't mean that that surface owner actually owned them. A lot of surface owners think that they own the subsurface rights, but in actuality they don't. They weren't aware that great-great-great-grandpa Jones sold them in 1885. So if they're not, and they just because they deeded off, maybe nobody did a search, maybe they didn't realize it, you may say, okay, now this person owns it from 1962 and not realize that they didn't have the rights to begin with. So it makes it complicated. How far do you have to go back? That's the big question. You may have to go back to patent, depending on where the property is. The other thing to do as a shortcut is if you can find out in that practice area where you're operating when most of the oil and gas rights were split off. A lot of times they're all in the same group of 2 or 3 years to the same company. So a company comes into an area and buys up all the oil and gas rights in this area. If you can find that, that could be a shortcut. Rather than having the chain all the way back to then, you can start there and see if it's in that range. And if it is, now you have a starting point rather than having to slog through the back 50 years. It's a shortcut. You don't want to make that your only avenue of search, but it can kind of bridge the gap of saving you a little bit of time. When you look at the lease for oil and gas, which is normally what they are, it's a lease, you want to look at the term. Does it have a specific number of years, or is it in perpetuity? Sometimes they could go either way. Most of them are permanent, but you want to, obviously, like we always do, read the document to see if there's a term on there, or if there's any reversion clause, where after a certain number of years it goes somewhere else, or if it's not used, it goes back to the company, or especially if it was transferred to somebody other than an energy company, to make sure that there's no variables about that transfer. When it goes to an energy company, the energy company knows how to structure that document to make it durable for the property. When Joe Smith has his buddy that says, hey, I'll buy your gas rights, and they do some kind of a deed or a transfer, that may not be exactly as complete as some of the professionally prepared ones, especially older ones. Really, an oil and gas lease search is not much different than a chain of title. It's a lot more tedious because you have to go back farther and read more stuff. It's really the same logic. There's no difference in it. My recommendation is, it's a pain in the neck, just do a few. to search back, you're going to be looking at handwritten documents, probably quill pen written documents, with Abe Lincoln's fingerprints on them, because these things go way, way, way back, especially in certain parts of the country, Pennsylvania especially, West Virginia, those Atlantic states. I mean, it's brutal. I mean, the deeds that you'll see are really bad. Some states have what's called pooling laws, where if you sell your oil and gas leads on your property, even if they're not used, the guy doesn't come in and drill in your property. If they drill in a certain area, you still get royalties, because they're pulling from your pool underneath your property. Depending on the state, you need to be aware of the pooling laws. That may be referenced in the split or the lease. It may not be. It may be something your client's interested in. Also, like all the other examples, think about who your client is. Is it the landowner checking to see if they have the rights? Is it a potential buyer seeing if they have the rights? Is it an energy company coming in wanting to see what the rights are? Because that may affect how you approach the search. It also may affect how you present and market what you're going to provide to that person. They may want to know more stuff. If it's a person owns the property, or a potential buyer of the property, they may want to know who owns the mineral rights of the surrounding properties. That might be of interest to them. If you put yourself in their shoes, what might be interesting to that person? There might be other stuff you can provide that does that. There's a couple other examples of variables, and with 50 states, you don't know all the details of every state, but one of the examples, from what I understand, in Texas, being a lien theory state, the lender holds title to the property, so they have control over the oil and gas rights, and can actually exercise control even if they've been split off from the surface. How much control? It really depends upon what's being foreclosed and how long ago the split was. I was just reading an article last week that lenders and attorneys look at this when they're looking at foreclosing. When they're looking at foreclosing in some states, if there's mineral rights, they may proceed in a different way. They may actually approach the gas lease owner in addition to the property owner, if there's going to be a short sale or some type of negotiated loan amount. It's something that we're seeing a lot more of. In most states, the mineral rights are actually dominant rights, because the mineral rights holder actually has control over using the surface to access the mineral or gas lease rights. In the lease or in the transfer statement, it allows them to use reasonable access to the property. They can take down fences, they can dig holes in the grass, they can do all kinds of stuff. They have to do it within reason. Usually there's statutory requirements and contract specifications how that's done. Is that important to know as a searcher? It may or may not be. It may be important to your client. So in the states that you're in, if you know those details, that can always help dealing with the client one way or another. If you're doing work for an actual energy company, they may also be interested in knowing what other companies have acquired contracts in that area, so they can find out what the terms are. If you're dealing with XYZ Energy Company as your client, an ABC Chemical Company has a lot of other oil and gas leases on other properties, they may want to know when they were acquired, were they acquired in batches, one at a time, what were the terms, because that might help them negotiate or at least know what their competition is. They're probably going to want to know that anyways. They may have taken the effort to know that, but if it's an early exploratory project for them, that's something where an abstractor can help that company get intelligence on what's going on in the area. Two complications that come up with oil and gas lease rights are, of course, complicated ownership. If this gas lease was severed in 1900, and now you have all these heirs that have split off, you may have 2 or 3 or 4 generations and have 20, 30, 40 people that technically have 1/40th interest in this lease. You have to chain all those down and track all those down to find out how you're going to list it. That's one of the complicated parts of it. There's no ways around that, unless there was a dormancy clause which erases all those. The other issue that comes up is in most states, oil and gas leases have several types of taxes. There's a severance tax that's due right when they do the contract, and there's taxes due on that ownership, just like property taxes in some states. If those aren't paid, those can have tax liens and be foreclosed just like regular property taxes can. So if that was foreclosed, then you have to find out, well, then who owns it? Does the state own it? Did they sell it to somebody else? Then if they go somewhere else? A third or fourth or fifth generation may not know that it was foreclosed. They may still think they own the mineral rights. They may deed it to somebody else, and now you're following the wrong chain. You're following, the surface rights chain when you think it's the mineral rights chain.